Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this podcast. My name is Dr. Irvin Scott, and I'd like to welcome you to Office Hours with Doc. Over the past 30 years, I, like many before me and many after, have devoted my life to America's children and its communities by working within the education ecosystem. In other words, I'm an educator. I've been a teacher. I've been a principal. I've been a district leader. I've been a nonprofit director. I've been a foundation executive. But so many before me have done those jobs, and so many people are doing those jobs, and so many people will do those jobs in the future. However, what we want to do in this podcast is look at individuals and listen to those individuals who are doing those jobs right now in order to do three things. One, we want to hear their stories, understand how they got to where they are, and what they're doing while they're there on behalf of America's children. And let's go beyond America, the world's children, because we have international perspectives that we'll be sharing. So that's the first thing. Number two, we want to better understand how these educators work within the ecosystem, not only as individual actors, because sometimes you have to do that, but more importantly, as team members to have impact. And then number three, speaking of impact, our goal is to hear how we might all work to accelerate our collective effort and impact going forward. These are the voices from the ecosystem that we'll hear in this podcast. If you've ever wondered what's going on in schools or school systems or school districts or however you think about schools in the US and the world and the lives of those individuals who are shaping children's lives, if you've ever wondered that, this is the podcast for you. Office Hours with Doc. Welcome. Office Hours with Doc. It is so great to have all of you join us. Thank you so much for coming back. Hopefully we're building up a little following. I am so excited to have Dr. Adam Parrott-Sheffer with us today. We have an interesting conversation for you because he's actually running for school board. He can give you the details on that.
Hi, my name is Adam Parrott-Sheffer, and I'm a Chicago Public School parent and a former CPS principal. These days, I teach leaders and educators across the country how to make school a better place for all kids. Earlier today, I filed the paperwork to be your school board member because I want what we all want for our schools. We want joy-filled schools where each kid is respected and celebrated for who they are. We want schools where each kid has access to powerful learning experiences every day. We want a school system where outcomes are not predictable by the color of one's skin or the dollars in their parents' pockets. This will require that we elect folks to our school board with experience improving learning for all kids and who are ready to address the challenges facing our schools. I believe I'm that candidate for our district. And I hope to get to know you better over the coming months, and I'm going to work hard to earn your vote and your trust in November.
But in Chicago Public Schools, one of the top largest, he'll know exactly its size relative to other school districts in the country. But I'm excited to have him. Adam, welcome to Office Hours with Doc, Voices from the Ecosystem. Why don't I just let you kick it off by giving us your sort of education leadership trajectory. How did you get to where you are?
Yeah, thank you. It is so nice to be here, and I'm so glad that you've launched this. As someone who read your book, and there are so many teacher stories out there, and you're like, oh my goodness, and like you killed it, sir. Like the stories, the quotes, everything in it has just been
Thank you.
masterfully done.
Thank you.
But I think it does. It anchors in the fact that we are our stories. And I don't think any education journey starts until you talk about your own experience, right? So, you hear a lot of, I've interviewed a lot of teachers, and so many told stories like, I loved pretending to be a teacher, right? I wanted all of that kind of stuff, right? I was teaching my stuffed animals, my little sisters. I was the exact opposite.
Mm.
I was the kid who thought the discipline code and handbook was a passport and was in trouble all the time, usually over issues of things that I felt were injustice, right? Kids getting picked on, bullies, that sort of thing. And it was, at that point of, high school where I was like, I got to leave early. Like, I've got to figure, like, I was ready to be out the door. And, the only things that kept me in school and walking across that stage was I had a couple of teachers who were social studies teachers who were looking out for me and had kind of tapped into things that I cared about. I wasn't giving up on my sports team, and luckily we were a winter sport that got us through March. And then, my dad came to me kicking and screaming, was helping me write papers, do all these sorts of things that just dragged me over the line so that I could get to that next step. Um, so for me, that's where the story starts, is, I learned viscerally that school doesn't work for everybody. And there are so many ways that the way it's designed is setting up kids to fail, not because there's anything deficient with them, but because we haven't really thought about who they are. So, I fell in love with teaching as a swim coach and as somebody who, spent summers working with folks of all ages and teaching swimming. That led into a career in the classroom, starting in Philadelphia, where I was a middle school reading teacher. And I like to say I worked my way up to early childhood special education before becoming a principal. And that's where I truly, found my love and passion. And I, jumped into that role, and I still think it's probably the greatest role in the ecosystem is being the principal of a school and getting to see what it looks like to truly transform a community. And then I've jumped to other parts of it, right? Where I've had these opportunities to be part of that technical assistance world of the nonprofit coaches. I've, worked at the district level, and, thought about those pieces with policy and engaged with the state on making sure that we had things that addressed corrective action issues. And these days, I am, I think probably two roles on the two ends of it, right? Every day I drop my two babies off at our neighborhood elementary school and our neighborhood high school as a proud public school parent. And I am in a, 5 months out of 6 month journey here, running for our school board here in Chicago, and really thinking about it from the governance standpoint on the other end, and having people to start to ask me things like, well, what do you think about this effort to fire our superintendent? Or what do you think about the fact of how would you close the $500 million budget deficit in our city, right? So thinking about it from like, how's my kid doing in art class today? All the way up to these things that are going to impact, 325,000 students in a city that is now, unfortunately, the fourth largest school system. We were recently beat out, but I don't think it's fair that the those southern county districts get to count themselves in the same way that us big, northern and Midwest cities do.
Yeah, I hear you big time on that. I wondered how you got beat out. So you were beat out by a county, not by a city, a true city.
Yeah.
Counties have multiple towns and communities that make up their system. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that trajectory. Let me go back just a little bit.
Yeah.
You talked about the type of student that you were, and then you landed in the principalship. Say a little more about what what were some of the things that you gained as not being sort of a traditional great student that actually fueled you being a great teacher and a great educator, a great principal. I think you alluded to it, and potentially a great board member one day.
Yeah, hopefully. So I think the first thing is, you learn that it's not your fault that school wasn't designed for you,
Mm.
right? Whatever those identity factors are, right? And for so many people across all different identities, there are ways that school is not fitting for us, right? And so I think some things I learned is one, right, that you can hack that, right? Just because people have said this is the way it is does not mean that is the way it must be. And so that feeling empowered and feeling like that it's a moral choice to hack it, right? That it doesn't, when we say, hey, this isn't actually meeting the needs of these particular kids that I'm working with or this particular child, um, that we're in the right when we say, how do we fix it so it does? I think it also taught me that it's really important to be able to see that there's multiple pathways to unleashing your brilliance. And just because we've said this is the one that everyone's supposed to do, that we can really adapt that. So for me as a teacher, what that meant is, figuring out what were the things that got my kids excited? How do we, build things like writing classes that were built around them creating their own websites to be able to tell their stories and or work through videos. This was 20 years ago. The technology wasn't as fancy or as easy as it was now, but it was like really thinking about things like that. As a principal, it was being able to say my perceived understanding of what makes excellent teaching doesn't mean that I'm right just because I'm sitting in this spot. And I think one of the things that I loved about being a principal was being able to stay curious, right? And be able to say, like, as this teacher teaches, even though I'm sitting there, the first time I went in, I'd be like, what the heck is going on here? But you would debrief with them and they'd say, and they'd start to explain all the reasons they were making the decisions that they were. And for 80% of them, you're like, that makes a lot of sense. Like that is like that's not my way, but your way really matters for these students in this particular content area. And in those places where we didn't see overlap, it created a space for conversation, but also a space where you didn't have to be right. We could sit with it and say, this learning's tough, right? Like creating these cultures and conditions is really hard work. So let's be humble and let's sit here together and we don't have to figure it out today. So I think those are the things that have been core to my work as a teacher and a leader.
Beautiful, beautiful. I want you to put the leader hat on real quick, the principal hat on, which you had on a little bit during your career. What's one or two things you wish parents knew about your role
Yeah.
that sometimes you're like, you know what? Especially given the fact that you're going into the role of overseeing potentially. I keep going, maybe I'm speaking things into existence, but you're running for board. What's one or two things you want parents to know about schools, about leadership, as you move into running for this particular position?
I think there's, the parents are rightfully anxious because they hand over the most important people in their lives. Um, and I think one of the challenges that principals have, that a school board has, is creating space for that anxiety and the fear that is associated with that without letting it making us make decisions based upon that fear. Right? Think about it, like the parents that are trying to, like micromanage the path for their kids, right? Like I think about that quote, right? Like prepare your child for the path, not the path for your kid. And that's hard to do because like you don't want them to make the mistakes, or you think these things like, if they don't have algebra in eighth grade, it's over, right? So there's all this anxiety, and yet like those are important things, and we should be striving to get kids there. But it's also recognizing that if we're doing this right, there's lots of support structures in place that help make sure that the kid has the path that they need, and that the principal is, 9 times out of 10 or more on the same page as you. It's just they're dealing with it within the morass of how do all those competing interests balance, and the fact that there's certain things they can't say, right? Like we might agree with you that something is completely intolerable and we're doing it. And then we have to look you in the eye and pretend we're not because everybody who walks in the building has to be treated with dignity and respect. And that there's things that you won't know. So for me, it's like, yes, I get the anxiety, but let's not make bad decisions because we're anxious. Let's hold that and then step back enough to be able to make good decisions and know that we are in it with you, even when it's a wink and a nudge, we are with you.
I bet you it helps you to understand these dynamics, having kids of your own, who are school age. And that contributes to this notion of understanding the anxiety, but also wanting to be in a position where you're leading, whether you're a principal, whether you're teaching, or whether you're overseeing the school district, where you have to make good decisions that are not driven by just that anxiety, that you feel yourself as a parent of kids in the system. And so, tell me a little bit about why it's important for you, why it was important for you to make the decision to run for the board. What drove you to do
Yeah,
that?
and I appreciate that you phrased it that way, right? The way that everyone phrases it is, so why did you want to run for school board? And I have to pause them right away. I said, no one in their right mind wants to run for school board. Half your superintendents don't want to work with their school boards because it's a recipe for like cultural chaos and mess. Um, and so I ran because it was really important that I ran. So for folks who are not from Chicago, this is our first elected school board ever. We have had an appointed board. We've had a mayoral control since 1990, since the early 90s. And so this is our first time that we are actually exercising the right to say who is going to make decisions about our kids. And of course, the second you interact politics and education, things get weird. And so what happened is all this was going through, right? This was a year ago they were supposed to make these districts. The state legislature sat on it up until March of this year. They then quadrupled the number of signatures you need to get on the ballot from 250 to 1,000. That's more than it takes to be be on the ballot for Congress in our state. It's Chicago. So people are kicking people off the ballot for technical things, right? So half the candidates who included other educators and folks like that were kicked off the ballot. And then you get into this whole weirdness that happens when it's politics, right? And people aren't 100% honest about things. And so if you go back to March, I was sitting around, I started listening about what was happening, always been committed to my city, been part of these conversations. And I said, on election day, it really matters to me that when I mark my first ballot ever for school board, that I can vote for a parent who's going to experience the consequences of their decisions, that I can vote for an educator who knows a little bit about how teaching and learning happen and has caused it, somebody who has done that work at scale and can think in terms of numbers of 325,000 kids and how to do policy at that level, and somebody who doesn't see this as the stepping stone to some other political office, right? Like they want to run for this office, not any office. And Irvin, I'm guessing it is no surprise to you. It was crickets.
Couldn't find anybody, huh?
No one was willing to do this work, right? It was one, and I live on the south side of Chicago, right? I live in a community that is 70% Black, it is about 20% Latinx, and 10% white, right? So my stand in this race is all sorts of cultural baggage and racial identity things that get looped into this as well. And I kept sitting up there and I'm like, we got to get somebody to run. And, kept talking to friends and they said, Adam, you're those things. You could do this work and, you work in higher ed and work in a way that you'd actually have time to do it because it's a, 20-hour a week unpaid job. Um, and I said, darn it, I think they're right. Like the way that this has been set up, it's been set up in a way that, your average parent's not going to make it onto the ballot. And while I might not be the average parent, I come with a certain level of experience of our system and things. For so many of those other criteria, I have it, but I also have the wherewithal to get through this process, even if I'm not endorsed by, the union or the charters or the business community, the folks that are putting, hundreds of thousands of dollars into these races. But somebody who can actually say, I can do this and I can run as somebody who is independent and focused on our kids, because that's what I've been doing for 20 years in schools. So I did it and I jumped through the work of all those hurdles and here I'm 25 days out. And I'm, proud to say that we're in it and that we're having a different conversation, that even wherever this goes, we're having a different conversation because just showing up changes the dynamics. right? When
Mm.
someone's sitting at the table and they can say, well, actually, this is what's going on in a school because I've been there. When they can say, this is what I'm hearing or this is what I'm experiencing. Like it really matters that each one of us engages. And maybe never everyone's running, but that you show up at the forums and you ask questions, that you're emailing folks, that you're talking to your friends about what matters to you, because no one has the perspective you do. And what I firmly believe, at least here in Chicago, I can't speak for other places, but in Chicago we get it done.
Mm.
Um, that you know, if we have those conversations, we can actually get to outcomes that are more creative and inspiring than anything that individually we could have made happen.
Beautiful. I think you're my first sort of small p political candidate that I've ever done on this particular podcast. So I'm going to ask you a sort of political
Uh-huh.
question.
And
Do
I
you
think we would
have
both say they're all political they're all small political
that's very
candidates,
true.
right?
That's true. You're the first capital P. You're actually running for
Yes.
an office. Um, what's your platform? Do you have a platform? Do you have a set of if someone were to ask you, what's your vision? What are you trying to accomplish when
Yeah,
you get
and I
in that
think that
role?
yeah, so I mean, a lot of it, a lot of education's local, right? So there's a couple of ways that we talk about this. One is in Chicago, my district is has the largest number of low performing schools that are not getting it right for kids. We also have $2 billion in deferred capital, right? So that means that, for an example, in my own kid's school, that means that tiles from the bathroom have fallen on his head while he was in the bathroom. It means that, necessary repairs have not happened. So for me, the most important part of the platform is, do we have schools where, kids experience mastery, they get to tap into their creativity, and they get to explore their multiple identities? That's our work, right? Like that is the core work of any school system, and that they do that in communities and school cultures where they feel that they're significant, they know they belong, and they experience fun and joy every day. But that's the educator in me, right? So that's the let's be focused on the core work, and then we have to step back because remember, this is our first school board ever, and we have to say that's the work of the superintendent and their team. And as the only person running across the city who has the licensure to be a superintendent, I keep having to say things like, and we got to make sure that we stay in our lane. And so part of what really matters to me as a board member is this first time is an opportunity to reset the culture. We're creating a new entity with 21 members on it. It could be the same old thing, or we can take this as a moment to, tell a new story about our schools, to interact with each other in a different way that's more collaborative, right? To have a board that does the things that, boards are supposed to do, but in public schools never do. Set a strategy, follow it, actually bring community voices together to create a vision, and then do that monitoring work, right? How are we doing? What are we learning by implementing this strategy? And how do we work with our superintendent and their team to make adjustments, right? We do too much of the this isn't working, let's throw everybody out type mentality in too many of our school systems. And so for me, the idea that we could set a culture that we see each other as partners who all have to get along at the end of the day, even if we disagree, because the kids are watching, and then see the work as the act of learning as a board and modeling that and letting that value system trickle through the organization, it could be a new day here in Chicago.
Wow. I hear three things in what you just shared. I'm going to see if I can summarize them and correct me if I'm wrong. And I don't think they're necessarily wrong, but maybe they don't rise to the level of importance as I'm getting ready to make them. One, I hear the deferred maintenance capital
Mhm.
point was more around safety and making sure that kids are going to schools where they can thrive and structurally and they can be safe, meets their needs. Two, I heard a very clear message around teaching and learning. Great teaching and learning that's tailored to individual student needs so that individual students can thrive. And then I heard something that was really interesting is more focused on your role in the board, the 21 members, and that is like operational efficiency, good culture, like we're doing our job well that allows the superintendent and those who actually execute on the things to manage and do their work well. Is that a good summary? What would you add?
That's a great summary, right? And I think we hit, three out of the five, like core Wallace Foundation, like what makes schools better pieces, right? Which again, if we're talking ecosystem, that's one of those important ways that folks have got to work together, right? If board members know what folks like Wallace are doing, that, here the Chicago Fund are doing, like we can actually get on the same page around language and priorities because the recipe's pretty similar. We just don't follow it ever.
Exactly. I appreciate you. You've said twice now the ecosystem.
Uh-huh.
One was talking about where you've been in the past
Mhm.
in terms of career roles. And then the other was about how your words, not my, I mean, my words, not yours, how you have to be thinking about things from an ecosystem perspective in this role. Say a little more about that. Like, I know you've got foundations in the Chicago area. I know you got technical assistance providers that you're very knowledgeable of. I know there's policy and advocacy issues both at the board level, at the state level. And a lot of people don't always understand that. And you
Yeah.
don't have to try to completely clarify it in the next 30 seconds or so. But how do you think about all those things coming together to support kids?
Yeah. So one of the things that I had the pleasure of doing over the past couple of years is, work with our friend and colleague Kathy Bodette and Carmen Williams and David Reese, and we wrote a book on improving systems at scale. And so for me, like when I think about the ecosystem, there's two pieces to it that really matter, right? The first is the coherence piece, and we talk about that in the analogy we use is our plants, right? Like plants only work if every part of it does its job well, right? The roots have got to be roots, the leaves have got to be leaves, bringing in that the sunlight and energy. There's the structures to get the water from place to place. That like an ecosystem is healthy when everybody sees the value that they add to it and they're celebrated for that piece, right? Like you and I are both preachers kids. You went and did it yourself, but right, like that, like we can go to the Bible on this one, right? Like the people have got to know that every part matters, and that's step one. I think the other piece that we forget about the ecosystem is that coherence comes with symmetry, and that the while yes each one has its own role, there are also echoes and fractals of each part in each other, right? It's the you and me aspect of, like, there's you and me and there's me and you aspect of this piece. And for me, like that really shows up in the culture pieces. And so when you're in a role like a board member or a principal, you have a lot of influence on what gets reflected through symmetry, right? If you act in a top-down untrusting way, that lack of trust echoes throughout the organization and pops up in the classroom with kids who are not trusted along all sorts of things, right? But if you act in ways of love or in ways of embracing creativity, those also refract. So I think the lesson for us in the ecosystem is however you are is going to show up everywhere. So be intentional about who you are.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. You said a couple of words that I think I want people to look up. Fractals,
Mhm.
which is a word derived from nature
Mhm.
that is really, really powerful. And I always thought, how can we get systems, organizations, schools, school systems to be more fractal-like? And then you said another word, which is love, which
Mhm.
I tell my classes all the time. I don't think we use that word enough when we are talking about schools and schooling. And so, awesome. Thank you for that. So as maybe two more questions, let's just be real. There's some bit of tension, chaos. I don't know how you want to describe it, going on with Chicago and the board right now. Anything you want to say about that? Any
Yeah.
sense making you want to make? Share.
Yeah, and I think to be for anyone who doesn't read the news regularly or think about this moment, we've had some big strife, right? We have a situation where the mayor would like somebody else running the schools. The superintendent has said, no, I think it's important that I stay here. Uh, the board of education, who would have to make that decision, said We back him, but now they've all resigned, and we're appointing a brand new board about 2 months before we appoint our first elected board or hybrid elected board. Um, and it's all over whether or not we should be taking out these high interest short-term loans, which, if you know anything about Chicago history, we've done a lot in the past, and we're still paying the consequences for those pieces. So what you have here is um, a situation where no one's really able to act at their best, and we've lost sight of like what's the end game. And so when I think about these sorts of situations, the first and foremost is like we're both school people, right? If you are replacing the the head leader of your organization mid-school year, that is something that should be done under very limited circumstances, right? Like criminality, harm towards kids, because it is so disruptive to what goes on across the organization. And right now in Chicago, we're talking about doing that without actually having somebody in place to take over. So if you want to talk about chaos. So wherever you land on any of these issues, there's a when to do things that matter. I think the other thing that we think about a lot is, again, let's think about those fractals. Do you want to work as a teacher in a system where folks can say, switch out your principal, and because it's a new principal, they don't like the way you do things, you're 100% out? Or do you want to work in a system that says, this is what we expect of teachers, this is what the results look like, and we're going to keep checking on them, giving you feedback on them. And if you aren't meeting them, there's no surprises, right? Like, you know what will happen. Like, we need the same level of due diligence with the folks who lead our system. It's not fair to tell people on one day that the goal is 20 and the next day it's BXQ. No one can lead under those conditions, and we'll never get a replacement superintendent who's as strong. So from a pragmatic standpoint and from a like how should organizations run, we've got some work to do here. And then I think the other thing that I think this gets to, like, the heart of this work is we are the collection of our experiences. And I think we're sitting in a moment where, for the first time ever, a candidate who is a former teacher is running our city, which is really exciting. But this is a city where, teachers have been harmed in the past, that unfair things have happened. The role has not always been treated with dignity and respect. Outside folks who have less of an interest in our public education and kids and more interest in pockets have been allowed to run things in lots of ways. And I think the problem is that that trauma from those earlier experiences stays with you, for all of us. And it pops out at times. And I think what we're seeing in this moment is we really have an opportunity to have a mayor who could show up differently. But because of some of these other things, these learned behaviors of how unions and cities are supposed to interact with each other in competitive ways, that the way to get what you want is to fight and to, get your group stronger than the other. We're missing a real opportunity to show up differently, because the conditions are in place for us to actually say, we all want the same things and the resources aren't all there. So how do we do it? Because the values are much more aligned than they have been in a long time, and the resources are limited. And we're not going to do it if we pretend that the pragmatic pieces of this equation aren't real. And so for me, that's core to this, right? Like, how do we live in this space of reality, pragmatism, emotion, story, and history, and realize that at the end of the day, we all are going to have to live together, right? No one's going away. The people who disagree with, if we demonize them, they're still living 3 doors down. And we're still going to see them on our walk to the grocery store. We're going to see them as we walk to school. So we got to show up differently, because the kids are watching. And we want
Yeah.
them to do this differently when they, are running it.
That's such an important lesson, not only for your board, but I think for our country, as it relates to the larger political um, issues and races and elections that are going on throughout the US these days. The kids are watching. I said one last one, but can I do two ones? But
You can do it.
we'll do them really quick. One is I'm not completely sure, but I'd love for you to talk about race as it relates to your candidacy.
Yeah.
You can talk about are there others like you, or are you one of, yeah, just talk about the role of race
Yeah.
in your candidacy, because we all know Chicago.
Yeah.
And then the last thing is the union, and strong union
Mhm.
in Chicago. And where are you around that relationship? And then we'll bring it to a close.
Yeah. So without a doubt, like this is Chicago, right? Like when we made these districts, they created them. The category that was published in the Sun Times in every category was the racial ownership of each district, right? It was called, this is a white district. This is like every negotiation was about, is it white? Is it brown? Is it black? And so that is embedded in the way that we think about things here, right? When I talk to electeds, the first question I said is, "You're a white guy on the south side of Chicago. One, how are you going to win this thing?" Um, and I'm talking about like people high up in the echelon here. So that is the air we breathe. And we have four candidates here in the 10th district. We have three black folks and one white guy. Here we got three men, one woman. And so it's without a doubt part of the conversation. And I think one of the things that I've realized throughout, because again, that was one of the reasons I was reluctant to run, right? Like, I believe that having representation that looks like you matters, particularly for our kids. And again, I shared with you all the other criteria that I also think really matter when we think about what it means to do this work well. And so for me, so much of that question of like, how will you win became to be answered as I got clearer about why I should win. Because when it came down to the why, it came down to things like spending 20 years in predominantly Black and brown schools, being responsible for leading teams that increased the number of kids on grade level in reading and math by over 20% in 2 years. It has meant being a parent at a building that is predominantly Black, and being in community. And it's one of those things I sat down and said, this is my home. I've had a great impact on it. And there is a moment in time where I have a skill set that is uniquely situated to do right by my larger community. And is this a hurdle? Is this a reason why perhaps to vote for the other person? For some people, yes. And we're all multiple identities. It's like you also talk to people and they say, no, I want the person who's the parent. I want the person who's the educator, who's been in our buildings. And so for me, this is one of those moments where the constellation of identities that all of us have are never perfect, whatever that means, right? But we have to be able to say, these are the ones that I lean into, and these are the ones where I need to be humble and say, I am not the expert on this perspective on it. And as I do this work, it is incumbent upon me to elevate my ignorance and to invite others to be part of that conversation and to help me lead and to help me understand the implications of what's going on from the perspectives that I cannot hold, because we cannot hold any identities but our own.
Hmm.
So that's your first question. And now I got to remind me, I went too long there. The second one
That's all
was,
right. Was the union your
oh yes,
relationship?
the union.
Role?
So I mean, this is a fun one for me, right? I am a card carrying member of the AFL-CIO Local 2 here in Chicago, and I am not endorsed by my union or by the union here in Chicago. I'm a parent. I'm a union member. I'm a 20-year educator. And the Chicago's teachers union, at least the political wing of it, went with a non-parent, a non-educator, who, despite being significantly older than me, is not from Chicago, right? He's got fewer years in Chicago than me. Um, I think that's interesting data because I also can point to the number of union folks and folks from the CTU who are, donors and champions of my campaign and folks who helped me gather signatures, right? So these are not monoliths. Um, and I think it's interesting and telling what makes people make the decisions that they do. Um, and again, like I think that labor really matters, right? The ability to organize our voices collectively is going to be critical to our ultimate success. I also think that it's problematic for the same party to be in negotiations with themselves.
Mm.
Um, and that's what we saw here, right? We don't have a board right now because the goal is to get a board that can negotiate the teacher's contract.
Mm.
Um, and so these things are complex. These things are nuanced. These groups are nobody's perfect,
Fascinating.
right? Like we all have to own the fact that we have our biases and we all do want what's best for kids. I firmly believe that. But we have to also understand that our limitations of our understanding of what's best for young people is always going to be somewhat clouded by where we sit,
Mm.
which is also why I think it's really important to just talk to young people about what it is that are their hopes and dreams. Because if we're all working towards what they tell us, we can get a little bit outside of our own blind spots.
It's a wonderful place to sort of bring it to a close, engaging directly with young people, which I'd imagine you're already doing in ways and you look forward to doing. Um, if you're successful in this role or just on an ongoing basis. I don't think we do that enough. So that's good. Listen, my friend, I am so grateful for you joining us for this podcast. It was illuminating on so many different levels. Appreciate the work that you've done. Appreciate the work that you're aspiring to do. Appreciate your perspective. Give us a closing word, if you will, just around how you're thinking about education going forward, no matter where it is, here or beyond, education writ large.
Yeah, so I mean the delight of education is it cannot be stopped, right? We are creatures of learning. What makes us, beautiful and important in this world is the fact that we are learners and we are collaborative and collective learners.
Mm.
And so whether it's through structures or anything, like we're going to be learning. And our job is to be that source of learning for other people. So, for all of our listeners, who are you going to learn today? And who's going to learn you?
Beautiful. Lifelong learners. My friend and brother and fellow preacher kid, it's always great to talk to you.
And father of a Nicholas.
And father of a Nicholas. I forgot. Thank you so much, Adam.
Yes.
And we appreciate everyone joining us.